Hello and welcome to our Bible study on 2nd Isaiah. I'm Edwin Weber, one of the pastors at St. Mark's Lutheran in Spokane, whose ministry supports this video series. If you're a financial contributor to St. Mark's, this is part of what your gift provides, so thank you. And if you'd like to help contribute to St. Mark's ministry, you'll find some information about how to do that in the description down below. Last time we were together, we talked about 2nd Isaiah's primary theme, the expression of consolation to God's people and the promise of restoration. This time, we're going to look at the other major theme, the secondary theme, if you will, which is all about the true power of the God of Israel. This power of God is reflected in two primary ways in 2nd Isaiah. First, the prophet speaks of judgment against the nations, and specifically against the nations who conquering or who harassed, if you will, God's people. And not surprisingly, Babylon is really at the top of that list. And second is the characterization of idol worship as being absurd and useless. Now, these words of judgment are kind of hit and miss for me in my personal experience, but I really actually kind of enjoy the prophet's expression that worshiping idols is silly. And actually, I find some of those sections kind of humorous. Maybe you'll enjoy them as well. So we have our overarching theme of the true power of God, and then we've got two significant ways in which this is expressed: judgment against the nations and the absurdity of idols. So let's take a look at some passages from 2nd Isaiah that illustrate this. Now if we turn to chapter 40, which again you might remember, that is the start of 2nd Isaiah, his inaugural prophecy in this section. We've already looked at chapter 40, part of chapter 40, which you may remember, of course, starts with words of comfort. But later in that chapter, we see this additional theme of the power of God, which says in part, "Who has measured the waters in the hollow of God's hand? And who marked off the heavens with a span, and closed the dust of the earth in a measure, and weighed the mountains in scales and the hills in a balance?" Now, all these words are speaking about God's power. They're evoking the creative work of God here. And what are mere mortals compared to the God, the all-powerful God that created heaven and earth? The prophet goes on, "Even the nations are like a drop from a bucket, and are accounted as dust on the scales. See, God takes up the isles like fine dust. Lebanon would not provide fuel enough, nor are its animals enough for a burnt offering. All the nations are as nothing before him. They are accounted by him as less than nothing and emptiness." So here the prophet speaks of the nations and these words of judgment, which here at least just kind of speak of the insignificance of the nations, compared against God. Then the prophet goes on, "To whom then would you liken God? Or what likeness compare with him? An idol? A workman casts it, and a goldsmith overlays it with gold and casts for it silver chains. As a gift, one chooses mulberry wood, wood that would not rot, then seeks out a skilled artisan to set up an image that will not topple." So here we see a link that's being made that contrasts this true power of God next to these graven images, these idols. So maybe even here you're hearing all these ways of expressing this secondary thing is coming up right here again in the first chapter of 2nd Isaiah. Prophet goes on again. "Have you not known? Have you not heard? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? It is he who sits above the circle of the earth. So again, speaking about God's power, God's transcendence, God is above the world, not in the world. God is there from the beginning. God created all these things. So even with this inaugural prophecy, this very first one, we see all the major and minor themes of Isaiah basically summarized into one chapter. And if you want to, you could read the whole of chapter 40 to get an idea of both what we talked about last time and the themes that we're talking about today. Now, the very next chapter, Isaiah 41, continues with this secondary theme and further explores judgment that is being imparted upon the nations. Here, judgment is spoken against the nation, and it is quite severe, and we will see some really harsh language here in this chapter and in other places. That's, the prophet speaks of God's judgment, and those words always can feel harsh. So what we need to maybe make that connection to is with God's power and the consolation and the promise of restoration to God's people. Those are overarching and perhaps even overwhelming themes for the author. We might get caught up in the judgment, but there are other things going on here too. So the prophet goes on in chapter 41. Listen to me in silence, O coastlands. Let the people renew their strength. Let them approach, then let them speak. Let us together draw near for judgment. Who has roused a victor from the east, summoned him to his service? He delivers up nations to him and tramples kings underfoot. He makes them like dust with his sword, like driven stubble with his bow. He pursues them and passes on safely, scarcely touching the path of his feet. Who has performed and done this, calling the generations from the beginning? I, the Lord, am first and will be with the last. So this notion of God being first and last, this language might be familiar to you. It's echoed in the book of Revelation, the very end of the New Testament, where Christ says, behold, I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. Alpha and Omega would be the first and last letters of the Greek alphabet. So this first and last imagery is echoed there in Revelation. But it draws on the themes of Isaiah. The prophet in chapter 41 goes on. The artisan encourages the goldsmith, and the one who smooths with the hammer encourages the one who strikes the anvil, saying of the soldering, it is good. And they fasten it with nails so that it cannot be moved. And again here, this is sort of connecting these themes. It's not just about judgment, it's also about the absurdity of idol worship. Now, you may have started to hear something that's common to these passages, this idea of fixing an idol so that it cannot be moved. It seems to be a metaphorical way of comparing the God of Israel with these idols. God, by contrast, is unmovable, transient, all-powerful from the beginning, whereas these idols seem to be fixed in a place. They have to be fixed or nailed down in order to prevent them from falling over. Again, God's beginning and end, being endless, uncreated, is sort of contrasted with the creation and formation of these idols. It almost seems to be like the prophet is saying, how can an idol have any power over anything when it's you, a human, that creates it? How can an idol have any power when it cannot move itself or prevent itself from falling over? And this is echoed again in a rhetorical way, in chapter 46. And so the prophet there in part says, and here the prophet is speaking with God's voice. So God says, "To whom will you liken me and make me equal, and compare me as though we were alike? Those who lavish gold from the purse and weigh out silver in the scales, they hire a goldsmith who makes it into a god, and they fall down and worship. They lift it to their shoulders, they carry it, they set it in its place, and it stands there. It cannot move from its place. If one cries out to it, it does not answer or save anyone from trouble." So I love these rhetorical claims of the prophet who juxtaposes the power of God with the inefficacy of idols. But it relies on a kind of a caricature of idol worship. When we read this, we definitely get a feeling that this is how the prophet views idol worship. Maybe even this is how God's people in Babylon, how they broadly see and experience the practice of their neighbors worshiping other gods. But the truth is, it doesn't really speak to the religious experiences of those who did engage in other god worship. Many religious scholars point out that those who did worship idols, many of them didn't view the physical representation of the god as actually divine. The caricature that they were worshiping idols would be as foreign to them as a suggestion that Christians that venerate icons are worshiping them. And that is what I mean, in a sense, when I say that these passages, they kind of rely on a caricature of idol worship. But what is perhaps still even more important for us to remember is that what's really going on here is the comparison that the prophet is drawing, distinguishing the transcendent and all-powerful, all-sovereign will of God from the fundamental claims of pagan polytheists, who those claims that they had about their gods, their pantheons, was very different. They were limited in power. They were not creators of all things. They did not create the universe. They did not exist from the beginning. And they were capricious and amoral, not immoral per se, but amoral. And if you're interested in learning a little bit more about this contrast between the monotheistic and polytheistic worldview, you can check out my video, "Why Did God Let the Exile Happen?" Now, it is important to remember that this expression of the absurdity of idols, it's all centered around the bigger, broader thing, which is about God's true power. God's power, when compared to these idols of the foreign nations, is something that's different. And God's power is one of justice. God's reign is one, not just of power, of earthly power, but one which seeks to put things back right. And that means, in the context of God's people living in exile, that would mean a recompense to the nations who have not been obedient to God's will. Now, inevitably, we have to acknowledge that that would involve God's people as well. And we talked previously about how justice and judgment is sort of provoked over God's people, but in a different way in 2nd Isaiah. Their sinfulness and their brokenness is acknowledged, but not necessarily, they're not necessarily rolled over the coals. The main theme of 2nd Isaiah is consolation and restoration. And in fact, in that inaugural prophecy in chapter 40, the prophet says that Jerusalem has paid her penalty. And that leaves a question then, well, if God's people sinned against God and they have faced their penalty, what about all the other nations out there? So yes, there are words of judgment for foreign nations. And it's not just about their other god worship, though those things are inextricably linked, but it's also because of their lack of ethical relationship with neighbor. And perhaps it is of no surprise to us, or shouldn't be of a surprise to us, that the harshest words of judgment are spoken to those against those who oppress God's people in the present moment. And that, of course, would be Babylon. So here we are now in Isaiah chapter 47. The prophet says, "Come down and sit in the dust, virgin daughter Babylon. Sit on the ground without a throne, daughter Chaldea." And here, Chaldea is just another word basically for Babylon. "For you shall no more be called tender and delicate. Take the millstone and grind meal. Remove your veil. Strip off your robe. Uncover your legs. Pass through the rivers. Your nakedness shall be uncovered, and your shame shall be seen. I will take vengeance, and I will spare no one." So here the prophet seems to kind of imagine a kind of retributionary judgment that's extracted against the Babylonians. We might say those who live by the sword die by the sword. And empires that conquer by these unjust means are inevitably subjected to the same methods. We'll continue to hear these things, these words of judgment in 2nd Isaiah, and really shouldn't surprise us. The prophet continues, "Sit in silence and go into darkness, daughter Chaldea, for you shall no more be called the mistress of kingdoms. I was angry with my people. I profaned my heritage. I gave them into your hand. You showed them no mercy. On the aged you made your yoke exceedingly heavy. You said, 'I shall be mistress forever,' so that you did not lay these things to heart or remember their end." So here the prophet makes a claim, an interesting one, which is that Babylon was just but a tool of God's judgment against God's people. But the folly of Babylon seems to be that she thought that her place was secure forever. This is at least the prophet's interpretation. And as a consequence, in part, she did not deal God's justice out equitably. Again, remember, the inaugural prophecy, which says that Jerusalem has paid her penalty twice over. So again, the prophet goes on here in chapter 47. "Now therefore hear this, you lover of pleasures, who sit securely, who say in your heart, 'I am, and there is no one beside me. I shall not sit as a widow or know the loss of children. Both these things shall come upon you in a moment, in one day. The loss of children and widowhood shall come upon you in full measure, in spite of your many sorceries and the great power of your enchantments.'" So again, these are words of retribution here, and kind of this notion of, just as you have made people widows and orphans, so now shall you be made a widow, so now you shall be made an orphan. There is some expression of idolatry here. You might notice the phrase "I am" is there and the prophet puts those words into the words of this woman of Babylon. That phrase "I am" has already been used by 2nd Isaiah, of course, to prophetically imply God. The God "I am" who reveals the sacred name to Moses out of the burning bush by saying, "I am who I am." But now that this is being put into the words of this woman of Babylon, the prophet seems to be implying that part of the sin of Babylon is that she has put herself in the place of God, the true sin of idolatry. And that's kind of interesting. And the other sort of subsequent sins of idolatry, if you will, other God worship, trusting in things other than the God of Israel, we see those things a little bit further. As the prophet goes on to say, stand fast in your enchantments. This is the prophet addressing Babylon. Stand fast in your enchantments and in your many sorceries, with which you have labored from your youth. Perhaps you may be able to succeed. Perhaps you may inspire terror. You are wearied with your many consultations. Let those who study the heavens stand up and say to you, those who gaze at the stars at each new moon predict what shall befall you. So, at least in chapter 47, the prophet doesn't directly refer to idol worship, but this judgment against Babylon, it is tied to an expression maybe that she has put herself in the place of God. It also draws on this notions of divination, astrology, sorcery, all of these other ways that may not specifically be idol worship, but they're all different ways in which people try to circumvent the true power and authority of God. So those are being, presented as being contrasted to the true and ultimate power of God. Can't use divination to try to change God's will. God's sovereign will is just that. It is sovereign and absolute. Now, something that's interesting here that emerges is this characterization in chapter 47 of Babylon as a woman. And this is another connection with the book of Revelation, because there is, the author uses an image of the so-called the whore of Babylon, or the prostitute of Babylon. In Revelation, she rides a fell beast, and she has a cup that is filled with blood, and she is drunk on the blood of the saints. And this implies that she kind of stands in as somebody who is who are killing the faithful followers of Christ. But Revelation draws on this prophecy of Isaiah 47 and its imagery here, where the virgin Babylon is cast down. Now, this is very important. Isaiah does not say that she is a prostitute. But the imagery here is kind of sexually suggestive, isn't it? Now, while most of the verses seem to draw on the idea of a young woman who sort of is thrust into this position where now, she's been sort of cared for and she's been able to live a sheltered life, but she's suddenly thrust into the world where now she must labor for her care, and as such, she despoils her youth and beauty. But there are also these notions of nakedness and shame that is here. Again, this isn't really a sexual image. It certainly doesn't say that she becomes a prostitute. But this image has been expanded on and seems to continue to express judgment against those people who oppress the Israelites, God's people, and later by Christians as those who were seen to be followers of Jesus. Now, one final chapter I want us to look at on this theme is chapter 45, which takes a slightly different approach to this theme of judgment. Here, the prophet looks at the means of judgment. How is this going to happen? And just as Babylon was a tool of God's divine judgment against Israel and Judah, so now Persia will be the tool God uses to make Babylon low. The prophet says, "Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped, to subdue nations before him and to strip kings of their robes, to open doors before him, and the gates shall not be closed. I will go before you and level the mountains. I will break in pieces the doors of bronze and cut through the bars of iron. I will give you the treasures of darkness and riches hidden in secret places, so that you may know that it is I, the Lord, the God of Israel, who call you by your name, for the sake of my servant Jacob and Israel, my chosen. I call you by your name. And that I call you by name, I like that because here the prophet does in fact use the Persian emperor's actual name, Cyrus. It is a very specific thing to say that this person is going to be the means by which judgment is inflicted upon the nation. And indeed, we do know that Cyrus the Great, as he's often called, conquered Babylon. And as the Persian Empire tended to do, it granted a great degree of religious toleration to its subjects, and as such, allowed God's people to return to their homeland. So yes, Cyrus was seen by God's people as a tool of judgment and a tool of justice and restoration. Now, historically, we know Cyrus conquered Babylon for his own empire building motivations. It's not like he was externally motivated by God to do this to save God's people. But again, it's important to remember that the prophet, whoever has the power of God in mind, sees that Cyrus is this tool of God's justice, this tool of God's judgment. It's God who makes the conquest possible. God is the one who's leveling the mountains and opening the gates of bronze here, and it has a purpose to free God's people. Now, something interesting happens here. The prophet refers to Cyrus as the Lord's anointed. And you may be familiar with this phrase, particularly as it is used in the books of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. In those books, it almost exclusively refers to the divinely ordained king of Israel. Saul, David, and Solomon, they are all described as the Lord's anointed. And the house of David that ruled in Jerusalem for centuries afterwards held on to this title. And it seems to have been lost at the death of the last king of Judah, who was descended from David. And so the author of Isaiah kind of looks for this restoration of sorts, this restoration of a just and holy Davidic kingdom. We looked at a few weeks back a passage from 1st Isaiah that seems to express that. And what's interesting is that 2nd in Isaiah envisions that this takes place, but not through a king of David's line, or even an Israelite king. Instead, it is the Persian Gentile emperor who is announced as the anointed one chosen by God. Now, this seems to be part of Isaiah's broader theme through the whole book, which is one that looks for righteousness among the nations and the hope that the light of the Israelites, they will draw all people to God, even these Gentiles. So in Hebrew, anointed one, it literally means Messiah, which is a title we Christians, we give to Jesus. But Isaiah imagines a different kind of Messiah, a human Messiah, a Gentile Messiah for that matter, one who brings salvation, but only in the temporal, worldly sense. Cyrus does change the fortune of God's people, but it is only temporary. They were allowed to return to their land, to build their temple, to restore things the way they once were, or at least try. But that only lasted for a short time. The grand swath of history, within a few generations, God's people would be conquered again and later scattered again. Now, our vision of Christ's messiahship is one that is different. It is eternal, and it is not dependent on earthly powers in order to establish justice or God's kingdom. And this passage from Isaiah is a key link in this development of the Christian concept of a Messiah, not just in Christian concepts, but in Jewish thought as well. And it would eventually lead us to the person of Christ and his kingdom, which we confess is still coming into the world. So I want to end things there for now, but I am so happy that you've been able to join me. Next time, we're going to start to look at some of the poetic language that the prophet of 2nd Isaiah employs to convey restoration, and specifically through this idea of how the whole of creation might respond to justice and restoration in the world. But until then, thank you so much for joining me, and peace be with you.